screen.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good morning. I think where everything is working here. My name is Adrian Jensen with Predictive Engineering, and today we're going to be talking about workflows. There's lots of different ways to get to the same end result within FEMAP, and I want to show you guys the three main paths that you can use. Let me bring up our outline here. And what we've got, like this. George, this coming out all right?
Yes, it looks good. And by the way, I'm George Laird, Principal Mechanical Engineer at Predictive. You guys probably know me. And I'll be in the background. I'll answer questions that you guys have. You can raise your hand and email, not email, but you can go on the little chat side and write out a question, and I'll be answering that. Otherwise, I'm going on mute. Have a good seminar.
Okay, thanks, George. So yeah, the things we're going to talk about today is just the different analysis workflows, the approach that you take to building any sort of model. It's always got the same structure underneath, but there's a different way to get there. So you can see we're going to talk about the file menus, the model tree, and the selector. And the underlying process that's going to happen, regardless of which workflow we use, is the workflow layout. We got to import our geometry, maybe prepare it. We have to create materials, properties. We need to set our mesh sizing on our solid or our plates. We need to actually mesh our geometry. We apply loads, we apply constraints, and then we're ready to analyze. At the end here, after we get through this, I'm going to show the same piece of geometry in this workflow, each of the three techniques. I've got a few little shortcuts and a few little tips and tricks, and also an API at the end. We look at this. This is a little solid blade model that it's one of the FEMAP default example models for geometry. And I've done a few changes here to it, a little slicing and dicing to make it look nice. But this is kind of a visual representation of what we do, the workflow here. And I'm going to do, for the first one, we're going to look at the file menu. I'm going to exit out of this, and I'll start by importing geometry. File, import, geometry. And I've got this solid blade model geometry saved here, and we can go ahead, we'll upload this geometry with our presentation on our Predictive Engineering website. So here we are. So these are the file menus, and these are great because you can really get to absolutely everything. There's a lot of times with the other techniques you might be hunting for a command and you can't quite find it in the file tree or the selector. The nice thing about the file menus, absolutely everything is available there, so you're not gonna hit a roadblock. The flip side is it's not quite as quick as the other two, but it's a good place to start and it's a good place to learn. All right, so starting out, we've got our geometry. Step number one is material. We're doing model, material. I'm just going to create a new material. I'm just going to load one from the library here. Let's just pick something. We got titanium. Okay. For the new users that aren't familiar with the auto replicate, it's one of the preferences. So you can see I've already created material ID 1, and it automatically prompts me to create another one. If you need to create a bunch of entities, this is a useful command, but you can always turn this off within preferences. We're just going to need the one material. Now model property, and I'm going to be doing a solid mesh, so I need to switch my property type over to solid. Okay. I'll select the material that I've created, and we'll give this a title. Again, you can see the auto replicate here, prompting me to create another property. Next, we've got mesh sizing. You go to mesh, mesh control, size on solid. We're going to select our solid here. Okay. And here's our different options: tet meshing, hex meshing, all of the different commands that you could change in here. Today we're just going to be doing tet meshing with our recommended sizing, so we're not going to touch anything. And you can see what happens here is that it puts a little mesh sizing along the curves. So you've got an initial idea of, all right, how coarse, how fine is this mesh going to be? All right, next I'm ready to mesh, geometry, solids. Now notice that there's hex mesh solids and just solids. And the one that says just solids is a tetrahedral mesh, and you can see by the little icon there. So we'll click that. I only have one solid in my model file, so it doesn't prompt me to select a solid. It automatically goes to auto mesh solids because there's only one, so it knows which one to do. You can see it's got the property I've selected, and again, we're just going to go with our defaults. Okay, so here is our mesh. A lot of times in our webinars we show the visibility, which is Control Q, and this allows you to turn off some of your entities. So we might turn off our geometry at this point, make our view a little less cluttered. But we still want to keep on things like loads and constraints. All right, working down the workflow checklist, we've meshed, now we need to apply loads. Model, load, and I'm going to go straight to load on surface. I could create my load set first, but the nice thing about this, if I go to on surface, I don't have a load set already existing, so it prompts me to create one. And we'll just call this pressure load. This is all about finding ways to save yourself a few clicks here and there, because when you do a lot of modeling, anything that's going to speed up the process is nice to have. Now I'm going to actually create my load definition. I'm just going to load up some of these surfaces here. I'm going to right-click, pick front. This will allow me to pick these front faces here. As always, I can highlight to make sure I've got what I want. For this example, let's do a pressure load. We can give the individual load definition a title as well. Okay, we've got our load. Now let's do our constraint. Again, this is under Model, Constraint, and I go right to On Surface, and it'll prompt me to create a constraint set. We'll just call this Fixed Base. Now we'll pick the surfaces I want to constrain. We're just going to grab these here. This inserts. We're basically going to have effectively a cantilever beam. And I'll pick my types. I'll just leave it with the default. It's going to be fixed. Okay, so if we look back at our workflow, geometry, materials, properties, mesh sizing, meshing, loads, and constraints. So now we can analyze. Model, analysis. This opens the analysis manager where we can create a new analysis. And we'll just call this static analysis. We're going to do number 1. And I'm going to make one change in here. We're going to use the iterative solver. Since we've got a tetrahedral model here, this iterative solver is going to help speed up our solve time. So there we go. We're looking at about 9 minutes with a little extra verbiage and explanation. So the next few, I might pick up the pace a little bit more. If you guys have any questions, be sure to punch them into the little webinar software, and George will help you out. So we've got a complete analysis here. The last thing we need to do is just a little post-processing. And what we can do here is I generally use post data. You can pick your deformation, your contour, your output set. There we go. So there is the file menus. I'm just going to start a new model here. And our next one that we want to look at is going to be Let me bring this over. We've gone through the file menus. Next, we're going to work from the model tree. Now, the model tree is nice because it's pretty logical. You don't have to hunt around, and there's little graphics for everything. And generally, I recommend just working your way from the top down. You can see here, this is a fresh model tree, unpopulated, and this is what it's going to look like by the end as I've created my materials, properties, etc. Again, I will import my solid blade model. Here it is. Now I'm going to work from the top down. I expand this. This is my solid. And the nice thing about the tree is you've got the highlighter up here. So if you have multiple solids, multiple loads, you can use this highlighter to help you visualize what exactly you're looking at. So here, I right-click, and I can do mesh size, het mesh, etc. So I'm going to follow the same workflow as I did before. So we'll start with materials, load our titanium. You can see it populate there. Next to my properties, switch my type to a solid. Call this blade. And there's my property. Now when I go back up to mesh here, I've already created my materials and properties. So mesh size. Now I don't need to pick the solid because by right-clicking this one in the tree, it knows which solid I'm referring to. There's my mesh sizing. Then I go to tet mesh. From the model tree, it's nice to actually explicitly say tet mesh or hex mesh. Tet mesh. Okay. There we go. We are all meshed. Working down to loads, you see that I don't have the direct access to load on surface or load on curve. I need to first create my load set. Then I can expand. You can see my load set. I'll expand that again, and now I can start adding my load definitions, like load on surface. Okay, there we are. We'll go back with our 500 PSI. And again, in visibility, I can turn this on. All right, same thing for constraints. First, we'll create this constraint set, fixed base. And then we expand that out, and we'll add a load definition, or sorry, a constraint definition to that constraint set. There we go. You'll notice a lot of times I almost do this without thinking. I'll right-click and I'll switch between pick front and pick normal. And for a new user, it's really important to use both of these, figure out how they work, and get comfortable with which one you need for which specific application. Pick front makes it easy for me. Okay, fixed. All right, so we are, again, we're ready to run. The analysis manager is accessible from the tree as well. Do the same thing here. Analysis, and choose our iterative solver. Well, actually, let's look at it without the iterative solver. Last time it was about a 5-second runtime. We'll look at this one without. See how much longer it takes. It's still a small model, so it should run quickly. It's generally the bigger models where you're going to start to notice more of a difference with the iterative solver. So we bumped up from 5 seconds to 10 seconds, but you can understand on a large, million node tetrahedral model that that can actually be some serious time saving. All right, we've got results. I can click contour and deform right there from the tree, kind of my quick access to my initial post-processing. And if I wanted to select different output vectors, I've got access to post data right here as well. I we pick something like von Mises. Here we are. So that was the tree. I didn't talk quite as much, but I got that one down to about 5 minutes. Before we move on to the selector, I wanted to go back and show you a few little shortcuts. And this shortcut is going to work for any of your workflows. And that is, we import our geometry. There it is. A lot of times, I'll skip straight to Tet Mesh. You can see this prompts me to create a material. And then it's automatically created a property for me. You click OK, and we're meshed. So that tackles the first 4 or 5 steps of our workflow and kind of condenses it down. Again, that works with any sort of workflow you're going to use. If you've got a solid model, you go straight to Tet Mesh. It'll create a property. It'll set the sizing. It'll do everything for you kind of automatically. And if you're not really worried about having absolute control over each of those steps along the way, it's a way to save some time. All right, so again, if you got any questions on the file menus or the model tree, go ahead and punch them in. Our last one here that we're going to work with is the selector. And I like to describe the selector as kind of the best of both worlds from the file menus and the model tree. It's this nice little condensed toolbar here. You start out by selecting what sort of entity type you want to affect, whether it be solid surfaces, nodes, elements. Once you have your element type, your entity type selected, you right-click and you've got a list of commands here, what you want to do, mesh, delete, load, etc. This is the example list for a surface. This is the example list for a solid. So there's a lot more available commands within the selector than there's at the tree. Not quite as much as the file menus, but it's quite a bit quicker than the file menus. It takes some practice, but once you get used to the selector, you can really quickly move along through the modeling process. Okay, so I'm going to start new model for my geometry. Okay. So here is the selector. If you don't see the selector up in your toolbar area, you can right-click, and it is called Select. You want to make sure that that is active. Once it's turned on, you can drag it. You can put it wherever you want. And so for this example, I'll drag it, have it out here in the main kind of model view area, just so it's a little bit easier to see. So again, same process. We start out with our geometry, and then we go to material. So I've got the material entity selected. Now I just right-click, and I've got any sort of commands that I want to affect the material. So we'll create a new material, load our titanium here. There we go. It's done. Switch to property. We'll create a new property, a solid property. Grab our material, blade. Okay, that's done. We go to mesh sizing, and you notice there could be a little misleading depending on how you think of these workflows. You could go to elements, and well, I don't have any elements, so I can't affect my elements. I want to go to solid, because if you think about the tree, you would set your mesh sizing on your solid. You pick the entity that you want to control, which in this case is a solid. Now I've actually have the entity for which my selector is set. And you see as I mouse over it, it highlights it in my work area. So I can click that, right-click, and it gives me all sorts of options: new, delete, group, and there is mesh size. You can see the little markings along the curves. I'm going to leave it on selector, right-click again, and go to Tet Mesh. There we are. Now, we could do the same little shortcut that I showed you with the model tree. Go back, hitting Control-Z, undoing everything. All right, so say we just imported the geometry. Use the solid selector, go to Tep Mesh, click your material, click OK, and it's done. So that jump to Tep Mesh is a nice little shortcut, and it works for any of the workflows. Okay, now we're ready to do loads and constraints. And previously I was applying my loads and constraints to surfaces. That will be my selector. And I can click this, and before I was loading multiple surfaces, and you can see I'm getting this little marker on the surface that I've selected, and I can only really pick one at a time. There's a few more options that are good to know about before you start using the selector, and that is kind of the selection mode. Right now we're set to select single item. You can also do select multiple items. So right now it's basically whatever my mouse is hovering over. It's going to be my selected entity. Select multiple allow me to click and add to my selection list. Now I have two of these selected. I can right-click, load. It prompts me automatically to create a load set and my load definition. Okay, now if I turn this back on to surfaces, you'll notice that I've still got those little markers on those surfaces. They're in the selection list right now. I can clear the selection list because I don't want to constrain those surfaces, so I clear this, and I can start picking surfaces here for my constraint. Now before, I was right-clicking and choosing between pick front or pick normal. When you're in the selector and you right-click, you've just got the selector commands. So how do you get back to that original right-click? If you hold the Alt key and then right-click, you've got your standard right-click menu. And I can switch over to pick front. Now I can pick the surfaces here, right-click, and we will apply a constraint. There we are. We've got our loads, got our constraints, everything is set. The nice thing about the selector is in addition to having this extra right-click list of menus, there's an additional one. If we were to go to something like property, and if you guys are familiar with bigger models, multiple properties, and the blanking techniques, in visibility, you could say, all right, property, I want to hide this property or show this property. You have access to that with the selector itself. So you can right-click, you go to visibility, you got these commands, but the best shortcut that I like, you hold the Shift key, takes you directly to the visibility. So I could pick this property, hide selected, there we go. This is a great way to control what you view without having to hunt through lists. It's really, you're just picking off the screen. To bring that back, I hold Shift, I right-click, and I can show all. So not only does the selector work for the workflow, it gives you additional quick access to visibility. Okay, I believe that is all of the workflow I'm ready to analyze. You notice there's not an analysis entity select within the selector. You're going to have to do it either from the model tree or the file menus. So that's an example of sometimes you can't be totally dependent on one particular workflow. There might be certain commands that you don't have access to under the model tree or the selector, the analysis manager being one of them. Okay, so we can take a look. There is our post-process results. So the main shortcuts that I want to focus on for these workflows is one, if you're working with a solid model, you're going to tet mesh. Jump directly to the tet mesh command and you'll skip a few steps there. Two, when using the selector, you hold Alt for your classic right-click command menu, and you hold Shift for your visibility command menu. A few more things I want to highlight. I'm going to bring up a new model, and this time I'm going to import a plate model. This was just some geometry I created. This is going to be plate meshed. And you'll notice that if you work through the model info tree, I can set my mesh size for this sheet solid, but my only options are tet meshing and hex meshing. When I go to mesh, I've only got tet mesh and hex mesh. So it is one of the limitations. For plate modeling, you don't have the access in the model tree. I could, though, use the selector. I set this to select multiple. I can very easily use the selector to do my plate modeling. Set my mesh size. Turn this back on. You'll see all those plates are still in my selection list. I'll go straight to mesh, and I can create my properties, materials, etc. So this one it's a little shorter of a webinar because you guys don't want to see me beat down on the same model too many times here. But it's good to recognize which workflow is going to work best for you, and which one you're comfortable with, which one works well, which one's quick. Before we wrap this up, though, I do have some more kind of interesting things we've found. We always like to plug a little API because they're very useful. And here we have an API. It creates a GFX entity, which is this red arrow here. It also creates a text box, and you can measure things in your model and leave this graphic that will rotate in 3D with your solid entities or your mesh. And this was written by, when we come in contact, also an Adrian Pavageau, and I found it very useful. His original one was set up to list this in millimeters. If you're feeling adventurous with the program, you can see I've switched over to display in inches, but it's pretty simple. If you guys look through the little API code, which we'll upload with this webinar material, you'll see what I've done there to create this. I'll give you an example. We can measure off of our solid wing here. And if you haven't used APIs before, you go to Programming, API Programming. Oops, I already had it open. API Programming. And it's just another pane like the model info or the entity info. And we're going to track this down and open the API. Find exactly where I've stashed it. GFX measure. There we go. So this is the program. It's not too horribly long. And we can hit play. First of all, it prompts us, it says, do you want to delete all previous graphic elements? So if you've been using this tool and you've got arrows and measurements everywhere, sometimes you might want to wipe it out and start fresh. Now it's as simple as defining a vector. So I'm going to snap to point and measure from this point to this point. I click OK, and it's done. Now, the number that it displays is a text entity. You want to make sure that you have text entities turned on. There we are. I found this API rather useful, and so what I did was, rather than opening up the API programming pane, finding the file, pressing play every time, I've created a little shortcut here, my GFX measure, that I've got right there for quick access. See, I can bang that out. And we got a little extra time. George, you think I do a little custom button demo there?
Yeah, you should. Show how you take the API and place it onto a toolbar, because that's something,
Okay.
you know, we talk about APIs, but then it's, okay, how do you take it to that last little step of using it?
Yeah, it's one of the things where you have this useful program to save you time, but if you have to track it down every time you want to use it, you're not really saving much time. So to kind of permanently embed an API like I have here in my, my measuring toolbox, we're going to go to Customize. We're going to do User Commands, and we're going to do, let's hunt down this GFX measure. So wherever you have the API file stored, you have to go track that down. Click OK, open, and you can add this. You can add this to your list. You can see I've already had added here GFX measure. Then once you have it added, you're going to close the Customize, reopen. Not exactly sure why you have to do this, but you'll notice under User Commands, now GFX measure is listed. Yeah, I've got some other ones here, blank all, my little fatigue program, etc. So I've got that listed there, and I can now drag that, and it's going to be a button. And what I've done is I drug it to this list here, where I have other measurement tools. This is a built-in FEMAP toolbar, and I've drugged it here. You can also customize it further. You right-click on the entity, and you can change image and text. You can add icons like I've done here. You'll notice this. You can copy images, copy button image. You can paste button image. So really, you can get extremely creative and customized with these APIs if you want to. But once I close out of Customize, that is now a button. I've got one on my toolbar. I've got several under this toolbar, and you can see it just links back to that API program, and you've got quick access to everything you need. There you go. So that pretty much covers it. We've wrapped it up in about a half an hour. So if you guys have any questions, I see one popping up here. Let's talk about these. We've got a couple. George, is there any of these questions that we should discuss, or did most of them get cleared up?
Yeah, I'm going through it. It's I got to expand things out.
Okay.
One of the questions was, you know, when you bring up the dialog box and you switched over the snap mode and you switched to snap to point.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things we sort of do all the time. We're so used to it. But bring up the selector, bring up that little dimensioning tool, and it's when FEMAP wants to measure between do it once. This is the vector locate. This is the classical box you see all the time. And when I first got introduced to FEMAP, it was like, oh my God, I got to enter points, you know, like actual X, Y, and Z numbers. And it was just like, oh, this is impossible. And that's where you learn that if your cursor is in one of the boxes, like on the base, put your cursor like base, X, Y, and Z. If you right-click when you're in that box, it brings up that your standard right-click, and you can say, well, look, I can snap to screen, snap to. And this is where you switched over to snap to point. And you can see it's right now it's set to snap to point. You could set it to, and then when you could set it snap to node. Now you set it to snap. Now you click once on a node, it returns that nodal value in that X, Y, and Z box. And then likewise, you could go to the tip, click on a node, and then that is your distance you're going to be. And then you hit OK, voila. And that was one. It's standard. And then when you were using the selector, it was how you were picking things on the selector. And so, like, go to the selector mode and pick selector for surfaces. Then pick, select multiple.
This is
Multiple.
select multiple.
Yeah, and pick a couple. And when you pick on the selector, one way to check because sometimes you can't quite, you're not sure exactly what you have. If you go to the model info tree, there's a selector list. And it will tell you, I got 2 surfaces. Then you can also use a little highlighter, get a little feedback. And also for the selector, it's going to put a little dot in there. It's going to put a dot saying it's selected. And then when you clear, those circles are, the little graphical circle on the screen is removed. Another thing on the selector is that if you go over on the little select toolbar, and you go one more over, what's that next one? Selector actions. You can go down to dialog. So then it brings back your warm and fuzzy standard entity selection dialog box to use with the selector. So we use the selector a lot. It's not the most, I want to say, it's not that intuitive. It's not something that when you open up FEMAP and start using it, you jump on it. I still remember when it was first introduced. It took me about a year to even touch it. I was back talking to the developers during a meeting, and they say, hey, have you ever used this? And I go, what's that? It's been out there for a year and a half or something. And they just looked at me. One I would say is, so Adrian showed the workflows, classic file menu, start out, and then the model info tree, which is the more modern way, so to speak. It's the way FEMAP is going to be using more and more. The model tree is going to get more elaborate, more capability added into it. And then there's this using the selector. We tend to use, really, it's a little bit of all 3, dominantly model info. We'll go down the tree, but we'll throw in a lot of the selector along the way. It's this blend of workflows that is the fastest. I don't know, I mean, some programs say, no, you only do it one way. This is it. We just give you this. Doesn't really work best. Modeling is really complex, and the fastest way is we found is that you're going here and there and there. So it's good to see all 3 at once.
Yeah, I actually had to kind of lock myself into using just one technique at a time because I use this program so much that, I'm in the tree, in the file with the selector, I'm all over the place. And it's not always the best way to teach people, but I've gotten to the point where I'm comfortable, I can do this quickly here, I can do this quickly up here, and I like the selector for this.
Yeah.
The idea is to get comfortable with the techniques individually, and then you can start mashing them all together to whatever makes it the fastest.
Right. Would you bring up the PowerPoint and go, I want to close on the PowerPoint with the workflow. And
okay. We had a few more questions. I was going to say, just to reiterate here, when you've got the selector, you hold Alt for the standard right-click menu. You hold Shift. Where is it here? Shift. There we go. You hold Shift. What's going on here?
I know you got to set the element. Go ahead and set it to like curves or something.
Oh, it's got to be something you can actually blank.
Yeah.
There we go. So you hold Shift for the visibility. Then I also did another keystroke here when I had it set to multiple select. You can use the Control to get the circular selection. You hold Control, you click and drag with the left mouse button. If you hold Shift, click and drag with the left mouse button, you've got a box select. And that's not just for the selector, that's for any time you're picking entities off the screen, you can use those to create large
because they're Windows commands. This is one of the things on the selector. When you're in selector mode, the standard left mouse button classically means, I'm going to select something. But when you're in selector mode, it's saying the left mouse means you want to select something, you're selecting it, but the right click is morphed. It's changed to another option. So the FEMAP developer says, well, that's a right click now. Only when you're in selector mode. Then the question is, how the heck do you get back to all your standard right click options? That's where they said, well, okay, we're going to have you hit the Alt key. And it's in the manual. That's what I'll say. I found them. I had to dig around. It was funny. It's like, where in the heck is this stuff? It's in the manual. Read the manual. I was talking about this, one of my favorite clients, and his comment was, you know what I really like about this guy? He reads the manual. Let's bring up the PowerPoint. I want to close one last thing. The reason we're doing this workshop seminar is that it came out of our classes. Somebody was commenting about, what is the workflow? You guys are all over the map. You do this and that. So bring up the first slide. This is the way I would close on the workflow. There's a lot of ways to get there, but this is the workflow. It's geometry, material, property, mesh sizing, meshing, loads, constraints, and well, you got part process, but how you get to all these different steps is, well, there's lots of ways to do it fast, but that's the workflow. What do you see? Any other questions? Should we get out of here?
I think that's everything. We can wrap up any other questions after the webinar with email. So
that's right. They know where we are. They can find us.
Yeah.
And then also we have a training opportunity coming up in October, and in beautiful Portland, in the rain, most likely October 15th. I don't know. It's just, it seems that when you arrange these training, you want to arrange it in the dead season, because if it's nice weather, people want to go do things with their family, not hang out with a bunch of engineers. So that's October 15th to the 19th. And then our next seminar is going to be on buckling. We're going to, it's not classical buckling, but we're going to ask stuff. People say, oh, you do the buckling, Larry. We're going to dig into it and talk about buckling, classical, and it's really compressive loading of structures. And we want to show about buckling of thin panels, and how you'd use a nonlinear analysis to assess the strength of the structure. We're going to talk about crippling, beam flanges. We want to talk about stability issues. It's a little bit of geometric nonlinearity. So let's go back to hardcore technical. Okay, that's it for me.
Alrighty. Thanks everyone for coming out and checking the webinar, and have an excellent day.
Have an excellent day. Bye-bye.